Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of Chasing Unicorns, a podcast series where we'll be picking the brains of some brilliant investors, founders, and industry experts to offer up different perspectives on innovation and entrepreneurship. I am your host, Justin Gia, and in this episode, my co-founder, Esteban Alvarado, and I sit down with our mentor, Jim Cooper. Jim is the co-founder of Los Angeles-based accelerator Braid Theory, which focuses its efforts on helping blue tech and blue economy firms build and scale into prominent ventures. We kick things off with Jim posing his views on the many problems within the startup ecosystem, and he also provides some insights on what it truly takes to be a successful founder. Hope you guys enjoy.
Well, there's a couple of problems with the ecosystem. One is that one of the biggest things that I find is that there's this layering of services, and everyone's kind of got this redundancy and layering of services, which means that you can go to one place to another place to another place, and there's fairly even distribution of the same kinds of, I don't know, I loathe to call it coursework, but it really kind of is, advice and everything. A lot of it is anecdotal, so it relies heavily on mentors, and those mentors very rarely are checked. They're verified as far as them being mentors are concerned, but there's very little follow through for whether those mentors have been giving good advice, or whether it's just, plain old anecdotes. I did it this way and it worked for me, so maybe you should try it too, kind of stuff. I'm not a fan of that. So there's a lot of that in the ecosystem, and I think that, when someone turns around to me and says, they've got a B2B business model, I cringe, I get goosebumps down my arm, and I think to myself, oh my God, that's not a business model. That's a method of approaching the market, but it's definitely not a business model. A business model has all of the things, there's a reason why the Steve Blank has 9 squares on a lean canvas, because it's more than just saying you do B2B, It's about a value proposition. It's about who your customers are. It's about a channel to market and how much you charge your customers, right? The cost of goods sold. All those things go into it. So it's clearly not. And yet, a lot of advice that mentors are giving is kind of vague like that.
Right.
I'm not a proponent of that. The other thing that I think we have, which is a lot more controversial, I suppose. But hey, I wouldn't be on a podcast if I wasn't ever controversial about stuff. So I think one of the biggest problems that the ecosystem has is parochialism. That's a real problem. Accelerators and incubators and goodness knows who else. I really want to hold on tight to the few startup companies that they've got, and they're unwilling to share or acknowledge that there might be better methods and there might be better advice out there for those startups. So consequently, there's this parochialism, or it can also exist in things like city departments and government that want to take ownership over startup success. And I can see why they do it, because they want to show that they're successful and that they've got, a whole bunch of companies within their portfolio. They've number of cohorts, number of meetings, number of, VC visits, number of companies that have been identified by, venture capital, number of follow-up meetings, a number of, companies that have been invested in, by how much, all of these kinds of metrics really really scream of parochialism. And I have a real problem with that. I do. I really do. I really have a problem with it. And it's not to say that you shouldn't have that rigor at the other end, right? The cone out. There are good reasons to have all of that. I agree that there must be the cone out rigor as much as my other end, which is the cone in rigor, recruiting and advising companies. You need to have the other side too. There's no doubt about it. But what I also find unattractive about the ecosystem is two other things that I think the two previous things that I just said, redundancy and layering and parochialism, leads to a problem with what we call network effect and economies of agglomeration. So what are those two things? Well, network effect, very briefly, is the number of startups and other entrepreneurs and artists and scientists and other kind of influential people are in a particular ecosystem, and how much they want to be around each other and create a cafe culture or I think in Southern California it's more like a craft brewery culture. So it's that building that. When you have parochialism, that skews it. When you lack rigor, it skews it. So I think that we need to grow that. We need to grow that that network effect, and not just to network. I mean, the networking effect is not about networking. It's about like networking one-on-one, talking and meeting other people. Network effect is about like how you would describe a neural network or a brain's network, right? So I like to look at it kind of more in that kind of mathematical sense of what a network is. And then the other one is economies of agglomeration. Now, this is really, really super important. This relates to how much it really kind of costs to run a startup. When you have a good economy of agglomeration, you have prices going down for service providers like, I don't know, IP attorneys, accountants, things like that, because there's a larger serviceable group of startups within that community. So there's a network that allows that to flourish, and so it lowers the price lowers the overall prices that are charged for certain services, and this is a good thing. In a community that doesn't have that, like some parts of LA that don't have, or Orange County that don't have that network effect, then those startups have to travel, if they're located in those areas, and those service providers have to travel to an area where there is that agglomeration and that network effect. And so consequently, in those areas where, say, in Irvine, where there's a lot of activity, then you tend to have more parochialism. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
So I would like to see a map drawn more evenly, I suppose, and I want that evenness not to necessarily be geographic, but it needs to be. We need to sort through what we classify as good advice and what's a good network, and we actually need to plan for what that should be next, rather than what we've got now, which is essentially a piecemeal operation of advising startups and putting them into an ecosystem. What we're really kind of doing is it's a bit like putting toothpaste back into the tube.
Yeah.
What we really, really need to do is just not have a tube at all. And I think that most people believe that they already don't have a tube at all, but I actually think that the way that the ecosystem works is just not like that. At least not currently like that. And then there's that, and I guess finally, I think, this kind of a distant fifth on my list. I suppose sixth. I don't know how many numbers now discussed, but distant fifth or sixth is this kind of predatory aspect to the ecosystem too, right? So there's a number of ways that this manifests itself. One is through service providers, and that can sometimes feel predatory for consultants that are not as honest or as good or as rigorous as others. And also on the other side of that is there could be some and this is probably heresy, but I'm going to say it anyway. But there are a lot of investors out there that view startups like a commodity, I think we've got to move past that.
Yeah.
Right. So I know you were mentioning how different advisors can have different forms of advice, right? Like some are really anecdotal, some are really formulaic, but it feels like there's not any singular truth, right? Like entrepreneurship is almost like an art form. People have different perspectives of it, and because of their experience, and it's very case by case. Do you think there is something closer to the truth, or is it truly like case by case for every startup? Like I feel like there has to be some middle ground, right?
No, there isn't actually. Sorry, Justin, to burst your bubble on that one, but honestly, there is a kind of there is a case. So there's not a middle ground, but it is a hyper ground for both of those things that you just said, right? So there's a case by case basis for everything. I mean, absolutely everything. And so there's not a middle ground. You can't take that middle ground. That middle ground is kind of neutrality, and it's kind of the tyranny of the middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of zero, no, absolutely not. Yes, it's always going to be a case by case basis, and yet there is this idea of getting closer to a universal truth. And so the only way of doing that is really appealing to your customers. So what are your customers saying? I remember this conversation I had with actually another Canadian company, ironically enough. This Canadian company said, well, our investors told us to do this. And I was like mortified. I was like, well, your investors told you, advisors told you to do this. No, what did your customers tell you to do? That should be the universal truth. The universal truth should be what your customers say. And customers are fickle. So, keep talking to them. The whim of the market is, that quote unquote invisible hand really is invisible. It can give you a good slap from time to time, and you can get blindsided by it. So I tend to think that there are universal truths, and those universal truths are going to change from company to company. How's that? How's that the title?
That's amazing. It's a hybrid answer to my.
It's a hybrid answer, right? So I think that that's closer to what's really going on. I mean, if we look at it from the perspective of the startup is always going to have to find a way of appealing to two or three disparate groups that want very different things. One is the investor. Another one is the influencer, the person who is not quite an adopter but kind of can champion for the startup. And then the final one is the customer, and the customer is actually the most important. The other two are not that equal to the customer. And so, hearing voices from the customer is probably going to be more important for a startup, absolutely.
I heard you say that investors view startup companies as almost like a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe like the current ecosystem for investing, especially right now because of COVID? Like, how are a lot of investors going about searching for new startups?
Well, I don't know, and that's a really interesting question, and I think that it depends. As an expression that I often say, which is there are horses for courses, right?
Yeah.
I think Esteban, you've heard me use that expression more than once.
Yeah.
So I hate to say it depends, but it really does. It really depends. If you've got a science or an engineering company, they're going to be very different to a consumer-facing kind of product company. and which is going to be different again to a tech company that does an app or a software as a service. On the other hand, if you're an investor that's approaching each of those markets individually, there's going to be different metrics that you're going to be living by. For example, I wrote a paper a long time ago, for a senior paper for my undergraduate on compressing the latency to market. So, you have a discovery of some kind, you want to commercialize it. We call it like the nascent end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum is the demand phase. And this demand phase can be in I don't know, for a cancer therapy, can be years and years out, like literally years away. And so that demand phase, because you've got to do all this R&D, and then you've got to do animal trials and then clinical trials, and then, it's cumbersome, it's unwieldy, there's a lot of regulations tied to it. There's a lot at stake, safety to the patient, right? So these things are a long way away, and there's ways that you can compress this, this kind of concertina, this demand and nascent to demand pathway, and that latency can be, compressed. In a software company, I've heard, we had a company from Singapore come through our accelerator, and they had an app that they developed in 3 months. They had something like 400 customers on the app. Far different, and that was in the shipping industry. Far different. I mean, way different to a science company. And so I suspect that the way that an investor will approach each of those is going to be different. I mean, there are some clear metrics that I think that a sophisticated investor will want in a startup, and one of those things is, the metric that I think is the most important is the multiple. How many sales are you having? How is that affecting your delivery of service? And how is that playing out on your pro forma? I think that's probably the most important metric. But, there are some investors out there that want to hear about the team, and they want to hear about the story, and they want to hear about, a range of other things. To use a movie kind of analogy, I actually think that's a kind of a MacGuffin, because entrepreneurs can be trained. You can send them off to a class, you can put them through a university course, you can replace them, there's a whole range of things you can do, right? If a company's not performing, you can ask someone to step aside and bring in a new CEO and have someone move to a more of a technology role or something like that. I mean, I don't know, I'm just guessing, but those are the kinds of possibilities, right? I mean, if you're talking about team, or even advisors, I've heard the expression, a company needs more grey hairs. I don't like that expression very much either, but I'm actually thinking the opposite. Do you really want to sit in a room with a stuffy guy like Jim Cooper, right? and hear a whole bunch of stuff about rigor and methodology that you just want to get on with your work? I'd be inclined, if I was an entrepreneur and I was in my 20s, I'd be inclined to forego the grey hair people and kind of go with some young people who have got the energy and the sufficient instability. I mean that in a nice way. They're not really working on their 401k. I'd much rather have them in my team than advisors who are in their 50s and 60s who have literally got grey hair or none. And their grey hair has gone grey because the kind of there's an adage in there, right, that the grey hair has come about because of all this experience. experience counts for naught. I've seen tons and tons of people fail in spite of their experience. So, I think there's a lot of luck involved. I think there's a lot of really good entrepreneurs they're young and have got energy and are smart and creative. They've got the will to succeed. I think those are the things that drive a startup forward. To finish off your question, Esteban, about investors, I think that investors need to move back to metrics. I think they need to move back to metrics in a big way, and not look at the cool factor. Another thing that I think is worrisome is that we're still investing in companies that are producing things that don't have that aren't solving the massive problems of humanity, like institutional poverty, institutional racism, climate change and global warming, sea level rise, and all the associated things with that. We're not solving the problems of building things that require sacrifice on humanity's part. We're still building stuff that's going to pollute. We still are building things that are going to optimize our purchasing through Amazon or something like that, when we really should be, especially during COVID, supporting our local businesses and stuff like that. So, I'm in that respect. I probably differ to most of my colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And so I'm assuming there isn't enough investment into these type of industries because the ROI isn't immediate and it isn't like 1,000x right away, right? Is there a way that we can make it more appealing to invest in companies that are actually built for social good and making like a positive impact on our environment?
There's no easy way of doing it. No. You've just got to find committed investors who are willing to do it. And I don't mean impact investors. I mean, the only way to really change the way really change people's behaviour is to hit their pocketbook and make it so that they either it's an incentive to build technologies that are in a robust way helping the environment or alleviating poverty or whatever it might be. It's hard work. It really is. And I think that a lot of investors are looking at ways to do that through a kind of this hybrid philanthropic and investor kind of model, like an impact investor or something like that. Still want to get an ROI at the end. They want to invest probably a little bit later, which means then that we've got this gap in the front end, which is the kind of the angel investor and the seed stage investor, the pre-seed investor, bridging rounds, things like that. And but what it takes, I think, is for investors then to also build a cadre of investors beneath them. And I don't mean beneath in a dogmatic way. I mean it in a structural way rather than a hierarchical way. But that can meet the challenges of raising funds, raising a fund, that it's seed or angel fund and encouraging them to build a pipeline of investable companies. I think that the more that a company is rejected rather than let me rephrase that. If a VC just wholly rejects a company and says no, but here's some advice and go away, you can come back later and kind of pitch us again, but this kind of a no for now, I think that's kind of the way that we've been operating. Instead, what I think is you genuinely need to build a pipeline development, And this pipeline development has to be, can't be arbitrary like this. It has to be built in a way that has a broad group of stakeholders. It needs to have and this is kind of, I guess, my policy thing coming at me, right? And it needs to have it needs some altruism. I mean, genuine altruism. I mean, I don't mean like, altruism like, looking upon startup companies like, noblesse oblige, or, it's not like that. It's more like it's more like building the foundations from, say, university startup teams all the way through, and so that you're constantly you're in contact with the startup companies, with the university teams, with the transfer office. You're asking questions about their progress, even if you're not technically an advisor, so that you're building up this group of and knowledge base of all of the potential entrepreneurs that are in that ecosystem. Because even if they don't stick with that startup or that university team or whatever it might be, they might actually be hired somewhere else by someone else, and you might meet them again, and they might have perfected that product or something with this new team, and now they're taking it to market. I think it's complex. I think that there's, I look at our model, and our model is that we want to look at a full pipeline, even before, this could be years out before we actually see them as real startups. We tend to kind of cultivate, I suppose, that really, really early stage development, proto development, I suppose, of startups, because I think it's just the right thing to do. Otherwise, why are we doing this? And why are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah. How do you see the investment ecosystem changing in the next 5 years?
I don't yet. I don't know how it's going to. It's a bit like playing a game of Tetris, right? The blocks come in at the top, and you got to kind of arrange them. Well, I think we're in that arrangement mode, and the blocks are still falling, so we don't know kind of how they're going to end up. Well, first of all, don't let a good crisis, get away from us. We've got to use it. And so I think that investors have they have a few options. The first option, I think, is to continue doing what they're doing pre-COVID. They can go after another market, which I've seen a lot of investors have gone now after the PPE market. Sorry, the PPE market, personal protective equipment market, and they've kind of totally left everything else aside, because there's some ROI in the PPE market. That kind of abandonment is it's going to be seen by startups. Startups are going to see that. They're going to go, oh, okay. Well, at the height of COVID, when we were still living on ramen, these investors kind of took their pool of money and they took it out of the market. When we were at crunch time and we were looking for, $100,000 to keep someone on so that we could, build a software as a service that could monitor, crop rotation to alleviate world hunger. Ultimately, that would be the goal, right? Then they left. They went somewhere else because they were concerned more about money than they were about building an ecosystem. I think it's gonna come back and bite the ecosystem itself. I think there's a lot of people like that in the ecosystem. I really do. It's a shame, but I think there is.
I think something more tangible than like 5 years in the future. What's like the
Yeah.
next 12 months look like for Braid Theory? We're coming
12
up to
months for
everything.
Braid Theory? The next 12 months is great for Braid Theory. And we're looking at some really great projects. You know, we've got a couple of Department of Energy projects. Uh, that's one of those projects up at the Pacific Northwest National Lab is looking at ocean observing. So looking at things like weather systems and the sensor data around storms and water quality, all of those kinds of things. So we're working on a project there. We have a couple of clean tech and ocean-related Canadian companies that are cohorted, and they're coming down. And we've got some companies that are in our portfolio that are really doing well at the moment. We have a couple of approvals for a couple of pilot projects, paid pilot projects. So we're pretty happy about that because we get paid. so those are really, really cool. We have some other projects that are coming up, which are pretty exciting as well. We're on a listed as proposal subcontractors in a couple of large kinds of projects. So I'm really kind of chuffed about that. That's really, really good. There's some continuing on with the more mundane stuff, of course, the day-to-day, everyday stuff, but nonetheless still needs to be done. We're still trying to find LPs for our fund. We have a number of other projects overseas that we're looking at, moving to maturity now that COVID-19 is kind of on its, we're getting. I guess we're the next 6 months we're getting jabbed with needles a couple of times to build our immunity for COVID-19. So we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. And this will be good, right? So we'll kind of bring some of those projects forward. Fun times.
Yeah. So you talked about how your portfolio companies are doing well, and I was just curious because I don't think we've ever chatted about this, but how do you really pick these companies for your portfolio? Are there specific qualities you look into? So I feel like you have slightly different views than like the general population of investors. You have slightly different values and different lens.
Well, they're not quite heterodoxical views, but they're some of them are different. Yeah, you're right. And we've spoken about this before. And but okay. So what do I look at? A defensible IP. That's a good one. Well validated science. It has to be pretty good stuff, and a competent business model. And a well developed, mature, and sophisticated business model. Not like, hey, Jim, we're a B2B company. No, you're not even going to last 5 minutes with me with a response like that. That's just nonsense. That's just jive talking. So I'm much more on those three things. I'm much more important than this. Don't tell me a story. I don't want to know your story. Tell me what your idea is. If it solves a problem, we can develop product market fit over time. That doesn't need to be immediate. Tell me what the problem is. Tell me the problem that you're solving. So tell me about the product. Has it got defensible IP? What's business model? What's an actual business model? Do you have customers? If you don't have customers, how many people have you interviewed? How many people have you gone out? Have you built up a archetype or a profile or personas of your potential customers? Have you done a really good analysis of the landscape, competitive landscape? Are there any kind of regulatory barriers or features or unfair advantages there? Are there partners in the market that can help you get there? All of those things contribute to a really good business model, robust business model. Yeah, those are the things that I concentrate on the most.
Right.
The personalities of the people in your team. What universities they went to.
But I guess
I went to a string of state colleges, and I know a lot of people from more elite universities, or quote unquote elite universities, and I tend to think that they're smart too.
Right. Do you think there's like a bubble where these Stanford MBAs kind of roll out of college and create their first startup, and it's immediately venture back just because of
the revolving door? Look, we
Right.
don't put up with revolving door economics, unit economics, when it's elected officials. So why would we put up with it in any other part of the economy either? I'm skeptical. When I was an undergraduate in the dim dark days of Cro-Magnon College, right? I was studying political science at the time. I did a quick analysis of syllabus from syllabi. Sorry, maybe, I don't know. I can't even remember. My English is not that good, obviously. Of different syllabus from other universities and what they were studying for the same sections that I was studying in that particular quarter. I think we were on a quarter system at that time. And I kind of looked at them and did some comparisons. And same books, exactly the same books, exactly the same course. It just at a different university. Okay, so some people will say, well, they're more elite. They got higher grades on their SATs. They were, selected because of a whole range of other things and everything. Really, if you were looking at this from a football team perspective, there are several really good elite academies in international football. Barcelona has a good one. Manchester United has a good one. Chelsea has a good one. Everton and Liverpool have good academies as well. But by far, a lot of them are. A lot of the really high performing members of the team are what I would classify as the yeomen of each of those teams, and they've been recruited through transfer or from other leagues around the world, and so I tend to think that that's actually the reality. That really startups are run by yeoman teams and not by the Stanford MBAs.
So I just want to say thank you, Jim. This is my last question as well. And I know you've been my mentor for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
Through my ups and downs, when I wanted to quit, you were able to help me keep my head on the path and keep me moving forward. So I guess just the last thing I would say is, what would you say to a startup founder who's launching their new business venture
Mm-hmm.
and they're thinking about quitting right now?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say in order to encourage them to really keep moving forward and keep striving?
I have one word: a thismos.
What does that mean?
It's a Greek word. So hoplite armies during the days before the Peloponnesian Wars, they used to, and particularly the Spartans, but I know a lot of stuff has been spoken about the Spartans, but hoplite warfare was characterized by this kind of shield, round shield, and a shield wall, and a kind of this long pike spear kind of thing, and the helmet with the little eyes, and the phalanx. So the hoplite phalanx. The way that they were able to maintain this shield wall was this thing called a thismos. A thismos basically means push. And in times when armies used to have to, line up and they were pushing one against the other, this was a highly effective way of conducting warfare. Mainly because the enemy army would crash into your shield wall, and the pressure behind you would and your shield wall will kind of hold you there. I think that's the approach that you need to take. I think you need to apply a thismos. You just keep pushing. Just stay at it. Ask for advice. There's no reason to fail. Really, I'm not into this whole failure thing. This okay to fail because you learn from your mistakes and everything. You can equally learn from your successes. You can equally learn from others' mistakes. You can equally ask, other people, hey, what am I doing wrong here? You utilize the avenues to advice, and you should always get that. There should be a good redundancy of advice. You should get a lot of it, even if it's conflicting advice, because the idea is to get a range of possibilities that then you can stay well informed about. Those are the kinds of things you can ask. Go do research. All of those things everyone's more than capable of doing it. Otherwise, there's 150 million people out there who have probably got more, mortgage or rent, live their day-to-day lives. I mean, it's not that hard, guys. It's just a human condition. So, get out there and just do your work.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Before I kick your ass.